Chapter 17 We Go Walkabout. The jungle man proved good as his word. For one chilly dawn he was suddenly within the tent, shaking my shoulder and in an urgent voice commanding, "Shake a leg, shake a leg. The owls have gone to roost. The day is half done. I'll put the billy on, and we'll see the crater today if you've nothing doing." And he was out at the galley lighting the fire, while I sat up in the bunk, dream hazy, for to me he was still miles away, asleep in his camp along the dry river somewhere. That was a glorious walk over the hills, though it was a bit tough climbing a goat track through dense bush away up that rugged volcanic cone. Long since a decent track must have been cut up there for sightseers. Throughout this trip my strange companion was trying me out. He led, I followed. He proved tireless, but I could walk too, for I had been compelled to carry the swag along some pretty dry tracks in New South Wales, and had already done about 3 years prospecting on foot. I set my pace, too, that lean greyhound ahead, and just walked. He did not encourage talk. In coming trips, I was often to feel thankful I was only a handful of bone and skin and sinew, with that enduring ally, plenty of wind. The old crater was well worth the walk and the climb. Like the socket of a giant tooth, the deep hole yawned at our feet when we pushed through the wild tangle of scrub that almost hid it. Rather marvelous how the tender green life that the volcano had once quenched under a roaring sea of molten lava had come again and smothered it, all but the glazed core, the throat of this deep natural chimney falling down there 300 feet to dim, motionless water. "No one knows the depth yet," murmured my mate. A problem difficult to solve. Maslin and Joss found this old relic while searching for cedar, just pushed through the scrub and gaped down this hole. If it had been in the night, I said, they would have vanished. I shuddered, staring down from away up here. I found it easy to picture, even without the jungle man's outstretched arm and quiet voice, how this dead beast had overwhelmed all the fair countryside with its merciless rain of death, drowning the very streams under a sea of molten rock, burning forest to cinders, smothering life far and wide under clouds of poisonous gases. The jungle man was to show me on this and other trips similar dead craters and beautiful volcanic lakes hidden throughout those mountainous miles, along the divide between the Barren and the Johnstone. What an unimaginable cataclysm must have rocked the very heavens over this huge area when all those awful things were thundering their brimstone. But now, but for an occasional low moan down there of probably some wind current, the old crater seemed sullenly dead. An eerie quietness here, as with all these burnt-out old mysteries, as of some lingering, ghastly memory of the dreadful things they'd done. And still, at this very day, away down there, the dull throat of the old crater seemed nearly perfect, as if it were only awaiting a polishing up, like the phoenix arising from the ashes, said a quiet voice. The aptness of the words startled me. He must have read my very thoughts. I turned and gaped at him. His steel-gray eyes seemed strangely bright. A little gray bird in abrupt, circular, chirpy flight came swiftly up from away down in the crater. What a place to choose for a nest! A bush clinging to the burnt-out throat of a volcano. How did that life grow there? Did the bird realize how safe its babies would be from enemies down there? But then, how on earth would its babies ever fly up? With a sheer drop, and that dark water below their very nest, the shadow of a smile flitted across his lean face as he gazed down into the crater. The aboriginals, his dreamy voice was saying, shunned the old crater as they did all the craters and even the volcanic lakes, as the abode of evil spirits. It seems their ancestors in considerable numbers were living happily here from the eastern coast to the Gulf when the volcanoes exploded one after another. A few escaped through the terror to build up the tribes again. They've told me remarkably strange stories about those times. Their storytellers are actually links in a frail chain of primitive humanity stretching right back to those prehistoric times, stories handed down from generation to generation. Anyway, from time immemorial, now the local tribes have used the terrible fear of this place to keep their women in almost unbreakable subjection. But a frantic love will at times chance even a volcano. When a woman broke one of those unbreakable laws of the tribe, she was dragged screaming all the way up here. Then the old men threw her out and over down into the old crater to be the prey of the devils. You can hear moaning away down there. The quiet voice paused. The natives have assured me, he almost murmured, that any of their women thus thrown down there never came back. Again I was gazing at his calm, steel-gray eyes. I shivered. It was so plain that any woman, any man, anything once thrown down there would never come back. That evening, to my surprise, we were in Herberton, and in the morning on the Cairns train to Atherton, only about 14 miles distant. I soon realized the jungle man lost no time while traveling in civilization. It was quite different, though, when he was in those queer reveries of his in the depths of some gloomy jungle, or sitting silently perched on a rock on a forest peak, gazing out over a vista of peaks, bathed in an ocean of sunlight. Such sights had a strange effect on me also, as if a man should glide up into space and just float away out and over. Atherton was a township in the building. I am told it is a fine town now. At that time it was only a few years since the Cairns railway had reached Atherton, but already there were signs that the camping place of the teamsters was being brought to a thriving agricultural life. Here at the foot of the Herberton Range, the teamsters used to camp before tackling the long climb to Herberton. The ceaseless coming and going of that little army of toiling teams to mining camps constantly being discovered had formed quite an important, if tiny, hamlet there, and the arrival of the Iron Horse meant permanent settlement. The first settlers, while clearing the land, grew that precious stand by of early Australian settlers everywhere, maize, but now dairymen were starting in earnest, many of them experienced men from the northern rivers of New South Wales, attracted by talk of the richness of being new scrublands in the far north. As a schoolboy, I'd watched the big scrub being felled along the Richmond near Lismore to make way for sugarlands, then dairying, and had seen development along the Cairns and the Tweed. And here, years later, to see the same phase starting all over again made this little walkabout all the more interesting, especially as the jungle man quietly kept me supplied with information on men, animals, timber, and incidents from the pioneering days of but yesterday to now. As in other trips, this unusual mate seemed to know everything. My boyish interest, however, was first attracted by the Joss House, an elaborately barbaric affair in the little China town close by. Here lived a compact little beehive of chattering Chinese in pantaloons and quaint hats, with droves of fowls and ducks all over the place. The Joss House loomed large in the life of this industrious community, with its hideous joss, its ever-burning incense, its garish pearl shell ornamentation, brass gongs and queer-looking offerings, its slant-eyed priests. I was to become familiar with such reminders of the Orient in the north. I suppose they have mostly vanished now. Such Chinatowns were formed by the Chinese diggers who remained in the country after the Palmer Rush. Many grew into the country. The businessmen among them became trusted and esteemed, and the storekeepers, once they had proved a white man trustworthy, would stick to him through thick and thin. Later on in Cooktown, I was to meet such Chinese storekeepers who were held in the highest regard by miners, sandalwood getters, bêche de mer men, and shellers throughout the peninsula. Perhaps genial old Ah Yam, known far and wide throughout the Hodgkinson district, was one of the better known. Goodness only knows how many diggers down on their luck old Ah Yam stuck to. I hope he is receiving his reward in heaven, for he had a few bad debts here. Authentic figures are impossible to come by, but old Cooktown records stated that 20,000 Chinese came pouring into Cooktown for the strange land of gold. Most of them were to return to China fabulously rich men, for when the Chinese teams working in a face cleaned up creek or riverbed, they left not one grain of gold behind, and we know that gold was taken from the Palmer in tons. However, many of these industrious workers were to die in the new land, though their bones would eventually go home to rest in the land of their ancestors. It was always a sacred trust amongst their living comrades to make certain that this would be so, and that trust was always faithfully carried out, except in case of shipwreck, or of those still more luckless ones whose bones, well gnawed, were thrown to some starving native dog. There were those who did not even reach the mysterious southern land of gold, but were wrecked in the treacherous waters of the Coral Sea. One such disaster is surely the world's classic in cannibalism, the wreck of the St. Paul on the Rossa Island group in Papuan waters. With 317 Chinese aboard, she was eagerly sailed to the land of gold. The barren reef on which she struck became the hopeless prison more frightful perhaps because it was open to the sky and the wild sea waves and the stars of heaven. By canoe, the Rossel Island men, armed with spear and club, took the shivering castaways as they wanted them, in batches of 10 to an adjoining fruitful island. Here they fattened them, just as we fatten pigs in a sty. Daily the headman tried them out, grabbing a handful of buttock, pinching arms and legs, while growling approval or disapproval of how the victims were fattening. When they were ready, these buck-toothed natives slaughtered, cooked, and ate them. Long afterwards, one demented wretch was rescued. He had survived only because he had been recognized and accepted as the reincarnation of the son of an islander. In those days of the little ships, 20,000 men were a hefty mob to transport in a hurry, even though packed like sardines. There must have been many human cargoes unloaded at Cooktown. Then their troubles really started. In gangs, they started out in the tracks of the white men for the distant Golconda through wild bush, and it was wild, too, alive with wild men. Even in my day, long after the Palmer Rush, men were speared to death in the peninsula. A mile-long string of these coolie adventurers would set out, each, except the leader, with a bamboo pole across his shoulders, from which were suspended the 2 baskets loaded so heavily that the strongest white man could barely lift the weight from the ground. Yet these bowed men kept at the jog trot across those miles and miles of hot bush. They had learnt the knack of it, of course, in childhood. As a rule, only the leader carried a gun. The gang would carry knives and clubs. They kept together for protection and clung to the tracks of the whites. The aboriginal warriors were close on their flanks, eagerly alert for stragglers. These were promptly speared and sometimes eaten, the hardy old Abo declaring with gusto that the flesh of a Chinaman is considerably more tasty than that of a white man. So they have assured me, and numerous other men anyway, the Palmer natives in particular. Old Chinese diggers I was to meet several years later, farther north still on Cannibal Creek, told me the same story. Chinaman hunting was considered great fun by the Aborigines. They ambushed the gangs too. When the heavy-loaded toilers were tired and slowed down in crossing the sandy beds of scrub-lined creeks, and later again when they spread out amongst the 1,001 gullies and ravines of the Palmer. It was a number of these Palmer Chinese who, liking the country, eventually settled into Cooktown and formed the considerable Chinatown I was soon to know very well. After Mulligan found the Hodgkinson, many of the Chinese on the Palmer again followed the tracks of the white diggers, who, so easily gripped by gold fever, rushed the new find. Again the Chinese diggers came plodding along behind, southward now through wild bush, again constantly ambushed on the long hot track, with no protection from the whites now, who had gone before. Chinese diggers have told me of some grim fights, when traveling gangs were cornered in. It was drop baskets then, and seize knife and club, and scream to scare off the devils. while the leaders would blaze away with what firearms they had, but attacking Aborigines can yell too, and such an encounter must have been a devil's pandemonium. Both sides must have looked and sounded pretty awful. The Aborigines with their spears and throwing sticks, and the Chinese diggers with their few firearms and long knives, screaming frantically as they charged the agile men of the wilds. Some gangs which left the Palmer for the Hodgkinson never reached there. These Chinese, now settled in Atherton, were mostly men from the Hodgkinson, for by this time Chinese diggers from the Palmer and Hodgkinson were to be found throughout North Queensland. Here they had leased land from the early white settlers, and were mostly engaged in maize growing. Several years had come the first land boom, and now white settlers were planting grass for dairying, while a tiny butter factory had just been established. The little railway siding was a scene of quiet energy. Enormous logs were being hoisted onto trucks. The giants among them seemed bursting at their gleaming chains. Surely a little train like that would never succeed in carrying those towering logs down the gorge. Surely trucks and all would be crushed under the great weights before even arriving at the lip of the falls. Or if the puffing little train got far enough to start on that precipitous downward grade, surely its mighty cargo would hurl it crashing down into the gorge. Before the railway, the mighty timbers of these scrubs were the pride and despair of men from Cairns to the tableland. In my day, there among the big scrubs, the bulk and height of those beautiful trees had to be seen to be believed. They promised wealth untold to the earliest settlers, yet it was impossible to transport such great logs down the range. At last a powerful group of timbermen, Burns, Phillip, and Company, were interested too, decided to attempt raft logs down the Barren River. A great quantity of beautiful cedars were felled throughout a dry season, the logs transported by team to the river to await the coming of the wet. The thunderstorms came, and the river began to rise, choked with the trussed rafts. The great logs groaned and strained at their shackles. Then the wet came in earnest. The Barren swelled and came roaring down, and away went the logs. The old-timers would never tire describing what must have been an awe-inspiring, a magnificent sight, as faster and faster the giant logs were drawn into the roar of the falls. Then they were over avalanche upon avalanche of mighty logs, hurtling over the lip of the falls, vanishing in foam clouds, to reappear in hurtling masses, drowned again in curtains of spray, seen for a moment falling at terrifying speed in water and foam, to reappear yet again like helpless matches in that green sea, thundering down in its 800-foot fall into the maelstrom of Devil's Pool, far below in the jungle-clad gorge. Very few of those magnificent cedars were swept unscathed down the river to Cairns. Some were splintered into matchwood. Nearly all were badly damaged. Some were tossed far up on the lower river banks. Even at this time, years later, a number were pointed out to me, hopelessly stranded. Some were caught in pools and would never work their way out, would be swirled round and round in the wet seasons of years until they were ground down to pathetic little sticks. The disaster was never repeated, but now the railway had come. Chapter 18. The Making of Towns. Up along the dusty road came slowly toiling team after team of bullock wagons, each wagon under a mighty log. Experts indeed were the bullock drivers of Atherton and Tolga, Malanda, Milla, and the varied districts of coast, and all the great hinterland. I never failed to stand and wonder at the bullokies parbuckling a great log to load the wagon, hauling it from the ground up, the sloping skids to the stationary, securely chalked wagon. That rounded log would be tons of dangerously rolling weight should it break loose. The whole maneuver always had to be a masterpiece, with perfectly regulated movement to the very inch on the part of the team and judgment of time almost to the second, of balance and strain and movement to the inch on the part of the bullocky. I always held my breath till the huge log was securely chained in place. As we strode out along the road, it was then only a scrub-lined wagon track to Yungabura. We saw again and again among the clearings in the timber the settler and often his wife busy among a forest of stumps, planting maize with the hoe, or planting grass seed, or burning off and building the first new home. As we walked along, the jungle man mentioned, if my memory is correct, that settlers were encouraged in all ways possible and were given 640 acres with rights to the timber. Numbers of settlers, he told me, paid for their first crop, their horse and cow and fowls and fruit trees and house, from the timber they felled and sold from the selection. Because this settlement began in much later years, there was not here back of Cairns the destruction of untold millions of pounds worth of beautiful timber sent up in smoke, as happened in the settlement of similarly rich timber lands in southern Queensland and in all the southern parts of Australia, although alas, quantities of lovely timbers had been burnt off before the railway came. There was a hungry and growing market for timber now, and the logs could be trained to Cairns, whence ships carried them to Brisbane, Sydney, and other markets. But it was only the cream of these beautiful timbers that were sent to market. Much timber that would be invaluable today still had to be destroyed in the clearing of the land. Thus were the scrublands of the Great Plateau being opened up. Thus, too, the big scrubs of Tumalin and the Evelyn would be cleared. Even now, Mick the Ganger's one-time mates were toiling out in the hot forest lands past Nigger Creek, laying the rails slowly but surely to the Tumalin scrub, bringing the iron horse and the axe, but development also, and years later still so would the great Tully scrubs be opened up. We strode along in happy mood. At least I was happy, not realizing my companion was hating what also brought a passing regret to me, the muffled crash from within the scrub as some giant was brought to the ground, tearing down an acre of trees with it. Again and again, too, came the sharp crack of a whip as away in there a bullocky cleverly maneuvered his team along a narrow track hewn through the timber. To me, those cool, dark, leafy tunnels creeping into the great scrubs were beautiful. Now and again a loaded team passed us, toiling towards the railway, straining under some great log of cedar or pine, walnut or hickory, maybe of lovely satin wood. The beauty of the old volcanic lakes is still fresh in memory. I hope they will ever remain as they were. To me, they were breathtaking and mysterious in their wildness, with their haunting atmosphere of aboriginal superstition. Writing these lines, I hear a ghostly whisper, and there comes faintly to me the jungle man's voice as I gazed, almost in awe, down upon each lake in turn. Wherever he is, he may still be alive, for all I know. Wherever he went after our last meeting, I'll swear he never again visited the lakes once they became well known, as they are now a beautiful tourist resort. I'll write no more about them, just visit them yourself. We were traveling light, carried a week's tucker at a time, billy can and blanket each. Didn't notice the load, slept where evening found us. The whole trip cost us only a few shillings each. I was learning how to travel surprising distances on a shoestring. Along a bush track we made for Mariba, my quiet mate wished to see old Pat Malloy, discoverer of Mount Malloy, on some business or other. From the cool depths of the scrub we stepped out into sunlit forest country of bloodwoods and tall spear grass, through which stretched a deeply rutted road, red with red dust. "What's the story of Mariba?" I asked my moody mate. "John Atherton, Jem Mulligan, Herberton, or the Teamsters," he replied. "Take your choice." Which means Mulligan found the Hodgkinson, which brought men swarming out into this then unexplored country. John Atherton, seeking pastoral country, found all this land out ahead of us, came along with bullock wagon and buggy, wife and young family and cattle, plodding along the great scrubs, struck the Barren and followed it down to the junction of Emerald Creek, built their slab hut, reared the family, and formed the present Emerald End Station, from which you can see present-day Mariba. Just after the Hodgkinson, Jack and Newell found Herberton, Christy Palmerston with McLean and Mullins, then blazed a track from Herberton through here across the Barren to cut the track from Port Douglas to the Hodgkinson. It crosses Granite Creek, within sight of Atherton's homestead. That crossing is midway between Herberton and Port Douglas. Because of that, and the water pools and grassy flats, it was just the place for a big camping ground, which it became, the Granite Creek coach change. As soon as the pack teams and wagons, then the coaches began carting goods and passengers to the new Herberton tin field. That camping ground became the township of Mariba, which is going to grow into a big town. John Atherton built the first building there, a rest house for coach passengers at the crossing. As field after field was found, it quickly grew into an important junction for the teamsters and carriers and Cobb and Company, for the camps and townships springing up practically from coast to coast. It quickly grew into a real town. When the railway came a few years back, John Atherton had been active in the development of the entire district to this day, and his son Paddy is carrying on the good work. John Atherton is known far and wide as the founder of Mariba. So, there you are. Surprisingly flat country. Yes, and yet it is the divide between the barren waters and the Mitchell, the crown of another tableland. The divide is so level, though, that the citizenry swear that when it rains along this road, the water in one-wheel rut runs east into the Barren, while the other overflows westward into the Mitchell. So one-wheel track runs away east into the Pacific, the other runs west into the Gulf of Carpentaria and the Arafura. Yes, he replied, that's about it, though your friends Mick and Jim would assure you you had water on the brain if you put it that way. What my mate's business was with Pat Malloy he did not say. Fortunately, I did not ask, knowing he was a strange man. I had fallen in with his moods as best I could, and we were getting along quite well together. There was plenty to interest me, anyway, in the constantly changing scenes through which we were steadily passing, and in yarns with the old hands when we came to some little township. He was never so patient on any other trip, as I was soon to learn. The favorite yarn of that grizzled veteran of the roads, Pat Malloy, was how he found Mount Malloy. It was soon after Jack and Newell, Brown and Brandon had found Herberton. Malloy was a teamster carting stores from Port Douglas up over the bump inland to the Hodgkinson goldfield, when the Herberton rush developed in earnest, and the track was made through the Atherton scrubs to connect with the track between the Hodgkinson and Port Douglas. Teamsters were offered big money to cart loading to the new tin field, urged on by the energetic John Moffat. He had bought out Jack's share of this unusual discovery, the Great Northern, and shipped from the south a stamper battery to crush the stone. Maybe the team hauling that old-time machinery along the rough track freshly cut through the virgin bush was the largest team of bullocks ever yoked up in Australia. I cannot say. The old-timers assured me there were 81 bullocks in the team, and they and the wagon and the teamsters got the machinery there. A little epic of engineering in itself, just one page in the fascinating book of the development of the tableland. Pat Malloy's job, though, was with stores. With a fellow teamster he set out with both wagons loaded. Safely they negotiated the bump. One sundown they camped at Chinaman's Creek. Next morning half of Malloy's team was missing, having strayed away during the night. He was pretty mad, for the teams were making good time, and Pat was anxious to strike the growing camp at Granite Creek Crossing while the weather held good. Several days later, still searching for the strays, very anxious now lest the natives had driven them away and speared them, Malloy rode up onto a ridge near Rifle Creek. Standing in the saddle, he shaded his eyes with his hand and gazed out over the country, a green ridge. He stared closely, for there was something strange about it. It did not appear to be the green of grass or shrubs. The harder he gazed, the queerer looked the ridge. He rode across to it and unbelievingly stared down at the bluey-green copper carbonate capping the ridge. Thus was found the Mount Malloy copper mine. Pat kept the secret for several years, for copper then was at a very low price. Then for some years it was worked intermittently by different parties as the price of copper fluctuated. John Moffat and friends had erected a smelters on Rifle Creek now. A little railway would eventually creep out to this little mining township from Bibura, a few miles down the line. behind Mount Malloy, beginning at Mount Fraser. A range runs north to the Mount Carbine Wolfram Field. In a future trip to the tableland, I was to work right along that range for a time on a mixed tin Wolfram reef on Mount Spurgeon. It was somewhere within the deep gullies of that somber old mountain that Jim Bell's tough-faced old moonshiner had worked his illicit still. However, that trip was in the future. Old Pat Malloy was to prove tough, like quite a number of the old-timers. He had quite a number of years stretching ahead along the track yet. He would not cross the last divide until 1923, 83 years young. Ted Troughton, the bullocky, who took the record load to the Hodgkinson, was another who lived to a ripe old age. He quietly started out on the last long road at the age of 103. Genial old Ted was a dozen books in himself. What books I missed in the yarns of those old prospectors and timbermen, the packers and teamsters, the drivers of Cobb and Company, and the earliest settlers. But shyness, alas, robbed me of all chance of a few little yarns from the womenfolk, who were gamer than the men. For after all, the men had the incentive of helping to break in a new country, where the rewards could be golden to the lucky ones, and there was almost certainly a cheery security to all who stayed and worked, though this fact could only be realized at the time by the dogged, far-sighted ones, whereas all that a woman had was the hope that her man might succeed in carving out a home, while she had the doubtful pleasure of looking after the brute. And some took a bit of mollycoddling too. However, at the time all hands and the cook looked upon the job they had done and were doing as all in the day's work. It was with regret that I heard my mate quietly say, "Right, this little trip is finished. We catch the train for Herberton tomorrow." I'd seen quite a lot, missed learning a very great deal on our shoestring trip, and I'd filled half a dozen notebooks with tightly packed scribblings, fuel for the bulletin. And though I never dreamt of it then for this book, back at Herberton I naturally was for stepping out for the camp at Nigger Creek, my strange mate seemingly about to say, "So long, be seeing you," drawled instead, "How about a walkabout to the dry river now? Then we can follow right up, cross the divide, and drop down on Stannery Hills or Irvine Bank, an easy walk, then back along the Herberton Road." He seemed looking out over the distance, not at me. "Righto," I agreed, somewhat surprised. Before I knew it, I was following him across to Jack and Newell's, buying a bit more tucker, and grudgingly a few more notebooks. Then I was following him out into the hills, already shadowed by sunset. We camped cozy on a patch of warm sand, sheltered by big gray rocks, down in the quiet bed of the river, which is a raging torrent in the wet. Sprawled on our blanket, smoking, my mate lapsed into one of his quiet moods, staring at the fire, which reflected back from the rocks, throwing his cleanly featured, somber face into bright relief. A thin-lipped chap with perfect teeth, firmly gripping the pipe stem. I quietly thought he would be a good-looking cove if only he would smile just a bit now and then. He was thinking about goodness knows what, that steely look in the hard gray eyes, quite noticeable in the firelight, which was dancing playfully on the big gray rocks. However, I could be quiet too. There were plenty of things to think about to keep a man company. Had I not fitted so naturally into this unusual mate's moods, he never would have asked me on a trip again. Rough country, the dry river, growing rougher and rougher as we trudged up towards the watershed. Every here and there we came upon a camp where mates were stacking wash dirt by bank or flat. Each such party ceased work to pass the time of day and ask the news. I soon sensed by their restrained, almost solemn manner that all these different parties, like my friends at Nigger Creek, did not feel quite at home with the jungle man. They had nothing at all against him. It was just that to them he was a bit puzzling. He was a strange cove. The same reaction exists among boys at times, should a lad have a quiet nature and not mix in with schoolboy life. That the jungle man quietly resented this feeling about him I eventually became sure, but he got some queer satisfaction out of it and retaliated inwardly with a feeling that was almost contempt. These parties we passed at every mile or two were gully raking and dry stacking, that is, working the riverbed, bank, or terraces, digging out the wash dirt and stacking it near a water race, a narrow channel cut by hand, to shovel it into the race when the wet came, for the dry river heads in a belt of country that is dry indeed, except during the wet. That dry stacking work is sheer continuous navvying. I was soon to be very surprised to accidentally learn that my traveling mate, while working in a dry stacking river, did not work by those back-breaking methods that sometimes yielded such poor returns, as Tim Ringwood, whom I later met away north on the Cooktown side, was so fond of saying, "It's all in the head, Jack, not in the back." A man can turn himself into a working bullock and hardly make enough to pay for his grass, while a little fox can lie low, bask in the shade, and nose out a fat feed with just no trouble at all. The jungle man worked when necessary, but he certainly worked with his head also. I was to learn lots more about him.